So I'm going to share with you an experience I had when I was 11. Um, I was growing up in the Palo Alto area, and both of my parents worked for Stanford University. Um, I had a cousin who came from Germany who was about 4 years older than me, maybe 5 years older. I think he was 16. And he was, I'm not going to say he was nasty because he's still alive. But he was a challenge for me at that age. He was always bullying me and kind of ribbing me and had a real attitude. And one day, my father decided to take us up to show us Hoover Tower. I don't know if any of you know of the Hoover Tower. It's right in the middle of the Stanford University campus. It's probably equivalent to 14 floors, 15 floors. And you take an elevator up, and basically there are four windows, one looking out of each side with no glass, just, well, this is at the time, so this was a long time ago, but there were bars on the windows fairly far apart. And I was standing there looking down, and I was looking at the cars and the people way down at the bottom. And the next thing I know, my cousin comes up from behind me and just pushes me all at once against those bars. I went slamming into them. Okay. Now, just in his defense, he has outgrown those behaviors. I have seen him since then, and he's grown up to be quite a lovely human being. But at the time, as some teenagers do, they have issues they're trying to work out. Well, apparently he had one with me, and so that actually began a sort of. I'd never had any anxiety experiences with that until that moment. And the next thing I knew, I was sweating profusely. My heart was beating really fast. I felt like I was going to just fall, like there was no safety under my feet. I wasn't safe in my body. And I went to my father and I said, I have to get down. Yeah. I don't know if any of you had an anxiety attack before or had this kind of experience, but it's utterly frightening because you feel as if there is no way that you can sort of work with yourself in that moment to feel better. Like it's like a wave or an avalanche of feeling that just begins to take over, and you're helplessly dragged down that mountain. Um, and I told him what had happened, but I think he was uncomfortable. He was a good man, but he didn't see it happen. And of course, he was trying to be a good host to my cousin and so on. So we were up there for probably another 15, 20 minutes. It felt like an eternity until we went down. And for me, for some reason, it triggered, that experience triggered kind of a lifelong fear of heights that I've had ever since. It's been much better as an adult, I have to say. And meditation practice has been invaluable for that. I've learned a lot of ways to kind of work with it. When I was doing yoga, I would go up and do Vrikshasana or tree pose up at the top of the Marriott building in San Francisco and look out. I think it was like the 25th floor right at the window, and I would just do the standing pose, the tree pose. So for those of you who don't know what it is, you're standing on one foot and the other foot is pressed against your inner thigh of the leg, and then you're raising your arms up and then bringing palms together and then reaching out. Anyway, for me, that was extremely helpful to learn how to work with fear in an embodied way. And so part of what we're going to look at is how important it is, how much of the body is really a part of the experience, both of fear and also of reintegrating our lives in an embodied way so that the fear doesn't take over. Yeah. So I had a really good chance to experiment, explore, bring practice into what eventually became panic attacks around heights. And that was difficult because I did a lot of traveling. And so I would often white knuckle my way through long flights and kind of learned, I got to know myself well, and I got to practice with what was helpful. And you might be a little surprised what was helpful, and I'll sort of let you fill you in on this in a little while. But basically what some people call, well, there are tigers and then there are paper tigers. Has anybody heard of paper tigers? So tigers, obviously, if you encounter a real tiger and they're not in a zoo, that could be frightening. You have good reason to sort of feel a sense of threat and to protect yourself and so on. But a paper tiger is that which only appears to be a threat. It's largely a maladaptive response. The fear itself is natural, yeah? It's there to preserve our lives and keep us safe. But a paper tiger is that which isn't a real threat. It just appears to be one. But it's really intangible. It's very much sort of insubstantial. And yet, they can appear real and they can have the same impact on us as if we are in a real threat. This is often what anxiety can feel like. It looks real. It may even feel real. But the threat itself has an internal referent. It's coming from within my mind, right? It's not literally something that is endangering my life in this moment. So that's one of the ways that we can sort of distinguish between what we might call a healthy sense of fear and a paper tiger. So I'm going to share screen. I have some PowerPoint slides. I'm going to try to sort of move through them fairly quickly, and hopefully it'll make this more interesting for you rather than just seeing my little box and me talking for the next half hour or whatever. And it's fine if you want to jump in with any questions, but we are going to have a Q&A later. Anyway, this field of trauma-sensitive mindfulness, there is a book that you might find interesting by David Treleaven called Trauma-Sensitive Mindfulness. And he is a therapist and a mindfulness teacher that has written this very, very good book. It's a fine book, really kind of looking more deeply into how we can work skillfully with mindfulness when there is trauma involved. So we'll start just kind of with this conversation of stress, because of course we're talking about profound stress. And I remember back, I think I must have been 22, I read a book, as I was majoring in psychology when I was just out of high school. And I read this book called Stress Without Distress by Hans Selye, who was an endocrinologist in the 50s. And he did a lot of research around stress and the body and stress and mental health and well-being. And the research that he had done with a lot of his participants, one of his conclusions was that the stressor itself, the situation that causes stress for us, itself on its own is not the most stressful thing, but it is rather our perception of the stressor that causes us the most stress. How we perceive what is happening, and also our own inner responses to what is happening. Our own feeling states, our own thoughts, our own emotions, our own sense of safety. If you will, the fight, flight, freeze response, which recently has acquired another F word called fawning, which is kind of interesting. I'm not sure who put that into it, but the more I read about it, the more it made sense. We'll cover that in a moment. So we're really talking here about perception, but rather not just a cognitive perception, but a perceptive process that involves a mind as well as our embodiment, our physical body, our somatic body, if you will. So what happens when we encounter a profound amount of stress in a short period of time, which, by the way, Hans Selye and other researchers since him have said, a little bit of stress is not bad for us. A little stress is actually good for the body because it helps us. It's almost like you need to get a cold once in a while for your immune system to be strong. A little bit of stress in short doses actually helps the nervous system and the endocrine system basically work through its rebalancing process so that it happens in what we might call a well-oiled way, yeah, like a well-oiled machine. It works well. And so his view was that, short periods of stress is not a bad thing for us. It's different when it becomes chronic. So we have these different aspects that stress impacts. Of course, the central nervous system, which includes the brain and the spinal cord. Yeah, these are like the large kind of processors of mind and feeling and consciousness and motivation, and also organ functioning and all of that. And then there's another aspect, which is the peripheral nervous system. That is something that is made up of finer sort of bundles of nerve fibers, if you will. Peripheral nervous system made up of two other subsystems. One is the autonomic nervous system, and this will feature prominently in our fear responses, as well as the somatic nervous system. The somatic nervous system involves sort of muscular movement, muscular reactions, and so on, as well as there's some link here to the digestive system as well. But the autonomic nervous system is largely seen to be involuntary. It is automatic. It's that when there is a stressor, this thing just kicks right in. Yeah. The autonomic process is made up of three other systems. So we're sort of moving down these subcategories. The sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is that aspect of my experience when I was pushed against the bars at Hoover Tower, where my cortisol levels just began to kick into high gear. What are called corticosteroids in the blood, the sugars that, as I'm perceiving an imminent and immediate threat, begin to prime the body for action. Yeah. The heartbeat speeds up. Sweating happens. Just whatever it is that you feel when you're feeling fear, or if you get a near miss, you step off a curb and a car is coming and you jump back. All of those processes are there actually to save you from harm, yeah, to respond to a threat. And this is all involuntary. It just happens. There is then a balancing part to the body. So there's the sympathetic nervous system that kicks in. And then there is what's called parasympathetic nervous system that basically tries to regulate all of those processes. And it sort of puts the brakes on all of that so that we're able to continue to function. We're not just freaking out, and now that is the way that we experience the world going forward ad infinitum, yeah? But there is a way that we're able to return back to a sense of homeostasis, or sort of a resting state, if you will. And so that's the job of the parasympathetic nervous system. It's there to kind of downregulate the heart rate. This third part of the autonomic nervous system is called the enteric nervous system, and that's really digestion. We actually, in our gut, we have a nervous system there. Yeah. So there is this, I don't know if the next slide has it. Okay, so here, before I move on to the next point here, I was going to talk about the vagus nerve. But here you can see kind of this layout of what happens. The sympathetic nervous system is that reactive part of the body that is ready for threat. It's ready to respond. Yeah. The parasympathetic has this regulatory balancing function. That is that which brings us back to this state of balance or equilibrium, what we call homeostasis in biology or neurobiological functioning, where things kind of come back to a normal state. The process of returning back to that state is what we call allostasis. So allostasis is that return back to homeostasis. Does that make sense? I know it's a lot of kind of terminology, but so allostasis is the process of regaining that kind of balance. Now here's where we start running into trouble. The allostatic load. This term refers to sort of an inability to return to homeostasis because of chronic stress. It's essentially, allostatic load is the wear and tear on the body, as well, and your mind and your emotional state, due to a chronic period of stress where you're just not getting a break from it. And unfortunately, what happens is our defenses begin to sort of get eroded. We get weaker. We feel less resilient, less able to cope over time. And of course, this has an impact on our capacity for anxiety. We are much more prone to periods of anxiousness, anxiety, panic, fear-related disorders, anxiety-related disorders, if you will, because of this allostatic load. So if we're under constant stress, we're more likely to experience periods of anxiety. And that's only one of a host of things that can happen. Of course, depression is more likely as well. So imagine regular meditation practice, how helpful that might be to be able to help us navigate sort of the chronic stresses. One of the problems, however, is that it also, allostatic load tends to reduce our motivation to practice. We just don't have the energy. And then that reduces the motivation. So maybe some of you are experiencing this every day, especially if you're in a job where you're feeling burned out or you're not happy. So back to this comment that Hans Selye tells us about the perception, the role of the perceptual field in chronic stress. Again, our perceptions of the stressor may determine how much stress we actually experience. So John Kabat-Zinn, the sort of the father of secular mindfulness in America, Hans Selye, as well as Martin Seligman, who's a positive psychologist at Harvard, has written about pessimism and optimism and learned helplessness and how we actually can train ourselves out of those states with time. The point here is that the conclusion, rather, is that there are choices in how we see things. It doesn't mean it's easy to shift our mind and our perception, yeah? But first of all, to know that there are choices in how we perceive our situation, how we perceive the stressor. In a way, this is what meditation is designed to do. It's there to help reshape our relationship with the things that are challenging. It doesn't make those things go away, but it can help us reconfigure, reshape how we relate to them. This is one of the aims. And one of the other aspects of this, I think that is even more impactful, is how do we see ourselves in the midst of the stressor? Yeah. So where am I located in this thing that's unfolding? Am I capable of handling what is happening right now, or this person is talking to me in a very disrespectful way? How do I see myself in this? You know, so that can add then an extra layer. These are all things that then are impacted by anxiety. Aha, here's this slide, the vagus nerve. This is not a gambling reference, by the way. The vagus nerve is this a very long nervous system that runs from the brain all the way down into the enteric system, into the gut. As you can see, this picture doesn't go all the way down, but we have to maintain some level of decorum here on the call. It's also called pneumogastric nerve, and it's an aspect of the autonomic nervous system, again, running from the brain all the way down to the colon. It is deeply linked into breathing and breath, and is that part of us that regulates the stress response. I don't know if any of you faint if you see blood or you get a vaccine of some kind. I have a family member for whom that's a bit of a problem. And largely this vagus nerve is where, when it gets overloaded, when the stress response is so severe, it basically shuts down the blood flow to the brain. And this is one reason why somebody might faint. There is this other term called vagal tone, which is kind of the state of balance of the vagus nervous system. It's kind of like, how is the sympathetic and the parasympathetic systems, how are they balanced? Are they in a pretty sort of calm state of balance? Or is there more arousal than rest? So it's basically the measuring of how we are. And there are certain things that can actually sort of reduce this arousal of the vagus nerve. And I've talked to my family member about this, and he seems to think it's been helpful. Interestingly, there are just simple things that we can do when we become anxious, because this pneumogastric nervous system is really where the anxiety or the panic or whatever sort of traumatic response we may be having is actually lighting up for us. It's in the sympathetic nervous system, but the vagus nerve is like right at the heart of that process. So there are things we can do. I have a few things here listed that we'll cover later, but one has to do with what I call rescue breathing. And rescue breathing simply involves counting as you breathe in and breathing out, with the out breath one count longer than the in breath. And then you breathe into 1, out to 2, into 2, out to 3, into 3, out to 4, and so on, until you reach a number that feels good to you. Basically, you are down regulating. You're helping the parasympathetic nervous system to put the brakes on the stress response when you do this. So even though it's involuntary, there are things you can do to impact this part of the biology. Once you have sort of reached a number, breathing in and out, then you breathe in and out to the same number, and the counting helps the mind settle, not just on the counting, but also on what you're noticing changing in the body, the senses, because you're bound to feel some sense of relaxation as you're counting and working with your breath. And so that change, that curiosity about the change, feeling that sense of difference is actually helpful to give you a sense of confidence, even if you go right back into unease. We do this enough to where we see, okay, this is changeable. I may not be there yet. I may not be free from all of this fear yet, but it is something that I now at least can work with in some way. Another strategy here is called Ujjayi breath. It's a yogic breathing practice where you're making a sound as you breathe in through the nose. Often, we talked about this recently on one of our Sunday night calls. If you have fogged glasses, to clean them, it's that action in the back of the throat. Only your lips are closed, so you can actually try it now if you like, just breathing in and then breathing out. It's almost like a loud sigh on the out breath with your lips closed. It immediately relaxes you. I'm noticing Kate is yawning, so maybe this works faster than I thought. Anyway. So Ujjayi breath, what that also does is it engages the senses. It engages the senses. It sort of occupies a space where otherwise the fear could easily interrupt. Yeah. And so the senses, the listening, the feeling in the back of the throat can also be very helpful, just to kind of bring the mind into breathing. And both of these will settle the vagal tone a bit. Interestingly, yawning, if you have a really good yawn and you really like devote yourself to it, right? You just dive in and you should see my high school students in the summer when I do a class and I have these 16, 17-year-olds trying to yawn. They're so embarrassed. It's like, ew, I'm not doing that, right? Hey, it works. It works. So giving a good hearty yawn, this actually impacts the vagal tone. It helps to settle that. Sighing is another one. So starting at the top, and I always visualize the top of the head. I sigh and I imagine the breath just dropping down through the body and down through the bottom half, through the feet, and then letting it go. This just outward sigh is very helpful. So often you can start by yawning, moving into sighing, and then what I call shushing. Now we may have been taught by our parents, don't shush somebody. Here we're shushing ourselves, so it's okay. And what this does is it's a similar concept where you put the tone, the sound, in the front of the mouth, sort of up here in the palate, just as if you are shushing, but you take a deep breath, and as you breathe out, and you let it go as long as you can immediately feel a shift in the body. And there's something about just gently, lovingly saying shh to your own mind that does have some kind of impact. So yawning, sighing, and shushing, these help also with the vagal tone to settle. If you ever feel like you might faint, do some yawning, some sighing, and some shushing, and see if that doesn't help. Chanting, another one. So those of us who have a very active chanting practice, you don't have to be a Buddhist to do this, but chanting is actually very, very good for that self-regulation, that allostasis back into homeostasis, because it's doing something similar. We are articulating through breath, through exhale, and through intention, all bringing that and sound vibration together into an intention behind the chant. So this can also be helpful to relax and to let things settle naturally. All right, so there's this other category that I have found interesting in reading some of the literature, the mental health literature. And often when researchers often talk about anxiety-related disorders, they pretty much limit it to three categories. One is somatic, the second is cognitive, and the third that I do not have on this list is behavioral. So a lot of cognitive behavioral approaches to anxiety are really all about helping the body, the somatic aspect, to settle, just like we just talked about with the vagus nerve. And then the cognitive, which is what kinds of thoughts are hijacking the mind. Taking notice, having a good sort of overview of what are the patterns of thought that get me in trouble. Yeah. And then how does that lead to behavior? And so cognitive behavioral therapy is there to sort of help us see how am I thinking and how might this be causing behavior. So how can I work with this cognitive behavioral relationship to change things in a more wholesome way? Now I've added two more categories here specifically for anxiety because the affective is so important. Yeah, it's not just thoughts and behavior that change our emotions, but we're really talking here about affective content or emotional states that are causing the fear in the first place. And then the spiritual, that anxiety also has a spiritual dimension to it, or what we might also call an existential or an ontological dimension. Ontology is just a way of being in the world. But what it does is we're not just these closed systems that are operating in fear. In fact, when we feel like we're separate and closed, that's often where the fear gets worse. And so this notion of turning the lens outward or deeply inward and then outward really matters, I think, in how we're able to relate differently to our anxieties. So the first, the somatic, is, of course, naturally, it's physiological. It's the autonomic nervous system, the wear and tear of stress on the body, this fight, flight, and freeze response. We don't need to describe that. As well as hypervigilance. Anybody who's had a panic disorder or anxiety attacks may have experienced what we call hypervigilance, which is, how's my body doing now? How am I feeling now? How am I doing now? It's almost an obsessiveness with the fear. Is the fear gone? Is it there? Is it not there? Has anybody had this experience? You don't have to share if you have, but it's like a feedback loop, but what we might call a negative feedback loop, because we get caught up in anticipating feeling poorly. We get caught up in this feeling of anxiousness and the fear that any moment it's going to escalate again. Yeah. And so we almost become so overly sensitive to the conditions of anxiety as well as how we're doing, that it almost sends us back into a cycle of fear. The cognitive aspect then can present as catastrophizing, just worrying about the worst case scenario. Now, some of this is normal. I'm sure we all do this to some extent. Yeah. But it's this constant worrying. It could also be rumination. It's the self-talk, what we call negative thinking or pessimism, that also it just feeds anxiety. Perhaps it's memories. So if I think about my cousin when he did this and pushed me against the windows of this tower, when I remember that, I can feel it. I have sort of a feeling memory of it. Yeah, I haven't forgotten what it feels like. As well as things like conceptual fears. So sometimes you can't define what it is you're afraid of. In the case of generalized anxiety disorder, where you just feel raw, vulnerable, and anxious, and you don't know where to place it. And that's its own particular hell realm, because if you at least can identify what you're afraid of, then you can take steps to maybe address it or avoid it, which is not the best way to go about it. But when it's generalized, it's just this overall feeling of not being safe in the world. It's also forward-facing. What will happen? Yeah. So perceiving a threat, we can see that as cognitive as well. I am in danger. Yeah, that is a cognitive piece. I am in danger. Or every time I do this happens, and it turns into the worst case scenario. I hope that's not true, but certainly here we're talking about anticipating something that hasn't happened yet, regardless of what our histories are. And so this is part of the cognitive. And then this part, and this for me, the third one, affective, which affective here means emotions, feeling states, is really kind of that visceral experience, feeling experience of anxiousness or fear. Sometimes anxiety can arise as agitation or irritability. Sometimes it can cause us to isolate, where we just withdraw. Yeah. And it's a feeling state. Yeah. Or we're feeling like we need to protect ourselves, or we're avoiding. Often there is a fear of intimacy here. And here I'm not just talking about relationship intimacy, I'm talking about a fear of closeness to the things that keep us feeling safe, the things or the people. And then there is this this is a clinical term, a safety signal, which is I need to hold on to this object, or I need to do this to feel safe. So if you carry, like some people, there's this whole history of people walking around with a rabbit's foot for good luck. And if they don't have it, I don't know how this got started, these poor rabbits. But if you don't have it, all of a sudden, impending doom arises. So we can call that kind of thing a safety signal. Or I always travel with this book, and if I ever lost it, I would freak out. Yeah. Part of the therapeutic approach becomes to try to expose ourselves in small doses so we don't rely on those things. Why? Because those safety signals communicate to us that there's a reason to be afraid. It's not a conscious process. It's if I have this pen here and I hold my pen in my pocket, and it helps me sort of control things a little bit better. Yeah. And the pen becomes a safety signal. Now, what it's doing is the fact that I have this pen and I need the pen is communicating to myself that there is a very real fear here. So part of the work in cognitive behavioral therapy is to begin to relinquish these safety signals so we're not constantly conveying in an embodied way a reason to be afraid. Does that make sense? At least this is one clinical approach. And yet we also have to respect our coping mechanisms at the same time. This is why we do this work very gently. Now that's considered more of a behavioral, kind of a behavioral part. This is why I have that in parentheses here. And then the fourth category, impacted by fear, the spiritual. And how does that show up? Certainly, as a chaplain working in a cancer hospital, um, people can either move more deeply towards their spiritual practices or their faith, or they can start to feel separate from it. And often it's fear that sort of gets in the way. And that can result in a lack of intimacy or a feeling of distance from one's spiritual resources. This is also true for trauma. In fact, one of the things that really characterizes PTSD is a complete severing of the intimacy with things in life that really help you feel safe and connected and enjoying well-being. And so part of the work with trauma is to kind of reconnect so that one can feel this sense of reconnection and this sense that one's world actually is sort of reconstituted in a new way, what we call post-traumatic growth. And also part of the spiritual that is impacted by fear can be a lack of connection. This can be with others or with a sense of meaning, meaningfulness. And the great Viktor Frankl, anybody who's read Man's Search for Meaning, which really should be the human search for meaning, but talking about the existential vacuum, that when we don't have a sense of meaningfulness in our lives, we tend to suffer. It shows up as neurosis, which was the term for anxiety back when he was doing his psychiatry work. So when we talk about PTSD here, just shifting more into trauma. And one of the things, if you look at this list, and we're going to go through it quickly, but imagine someone who has these symptoms, having been through a traumatic experience, and now trying to sit and practice settling a mind into a space of open awareness. Yeah? Which is how it's been for a long, long time, until recently, until we've started really wanting to integrate more trauma-sensitive mindfulness. But what characterizes someone who potentially will be sitting with PTSD and trying to practice? It may not be that they go through all of these, but we never know what combinations of them someone might experience. And one, of course, is the intrusive thoughts, or re-experiencing a traumatic event. If it was violence, or sexual violence, or combat, maybe it was a racial trauma. And sitting in meditation, and you're being told now to just focus on your breath and focus on this and that, and then you have a 15 minutes of silence. That leaves room for what? It leaves room for all the things that you are keeping out of sight just to function, to fill in that space. And so people have reported, who have had trauma, have reported going to retreats in particular, but also sittings where they're just in this sort of vast floating space, and all that's bubbling up here is frightening, and it's re-traumatizing. So that's one quote-unquote danger, I would suppose. The next one is a lack of bodily safety. If you're not safe in your physical body, yeah, and you're being instructed to do, say, a body scan, and just focus on your foot, focus on your thighs, your pelvic muscle, your abdomen, your chest, that can be triggering for certain kinds of trauma. You're just not feeling safe in your own skin. And if that's the case, then it's going to be hard just to kind of click into body awareness and have it be a safe experience. The other thing is that we also, whether it's anxiety or trauma, we spend a lot of time avoiding reminders of the triggers. Yeah. So for me, for a long time, it was avoiding high places. I just wouldn't go. I remember when I lived in New York City, there are a few tall buildings there. And of course, everyone wanted to go up when it was still there anyway, the World Trade Center and Empire State Building. And I was like, I'm staying down here. You guys go up. Yeah. That quality of avoidance is also true for PTSD. Anything that might remind you of a trauma, you're going to avoid at all costs out of wanting to avoid being triggered. Yeah. So imagine now somebody's putting you right into the heart of your own mind, How do you avoid things that are there? Um, Restlessness and agitation, yeah. So we all experience these when we meditate at some point. If you've had trauma, this can be a manifestation of anxiety, unease that's growing, a sense of discomfort in the body and in the space that you're creating while you're meditating. It can even lead perhaps to panic attacks. And yet you're there trying to be quiet in the meditation hall. And so you get into this real struggle experientially, and it's not good. It's not a good situation. The other thing is, most people who teach us mindfulness or meditation are inviting us into an intimate interior space, one ideally that is nourishing and life-giving and heart-opening. And yet, if you've been through trauma, there may be an absence of that intimacy that's there, and doing that might be problematic. There may not be a sense of autonomy that you can feel in doing the practice, autonomy with oneself, and a sense of intimacy with others or with the world. Do I trust this teacher? Yeah. If somebody has been violated in some way, and then by a certain kind of person who is leading the practice, it may, of course, may not feel safe at all. And so what happens here can be a sense of withdrawal. You start withdrawing, and it's very hard to meditate at that point because you can't be clear and present necessarily until you build some capacity, which also translates into a sense of loss of agency. And, meditation is very good at cultivating a sense of agency or capacity. But if you're starting out already with a mistrust and without that, if it's not trauma informed, it's going to be very hard to really be able to experience that. In fact, we may experience it once more of the opposite. So what are outcomes of someone experiencing these things? Profound discouragement. Wow, this whole field of meditation or mindfulness and Buddhism overall, I can't do it. This is beyond me. This is not for me. A sense of hopelessness, perhaps. Obviously, triggering is possible, as well as a sense of failure. Man, I'm really messed up. I really can't do this. Yeah. Doubt, the fifth hindrance in mindfulness. Mindfulness has these 5 hindrances, all 5 of which can be outcomes of PTSD and trauma. Clinging, grasping, avoidance, aversion, restlessness, laxity, checking out, avoidance, or doubt, which is the hardest of those. And it might even then lead to someone trying other ways of numbing themselves with either substances or other things. So this stuff really matters. And if it's your experience that you've had these experiences, there's a good reason why you feel this way. And there are ways to enter into this that are much more skillful with the help of somebody who is trauma informed. You can make great strides even with practice. It takes the right teacher. We're not going to go into neuroplasticity. I'm already watching the time slip away here. But the point to this slide is really that our brains are really much more changeable than we ever used to think scientifically. By now, maybe we all know this. We may be skeptical, but we are not as hardwired. This notion of neuroplasticity, or that the neurons and the neural pathways in the brain that are basically these channels that are cut, if you will, for want of a better term, or highways that are formed around tendencies and habits. We can actually change them, and it takes a little bit of effort, but it is possible. We can actually overcome challenges with repetition, which is why we stick to our meditation practice as much as we can. Intensity matters, and then time, over time. And then I have a 4th one here that I've added to this sort of scientific view of change, which is vigilance. And it includes motivation. Without motivation or vigilance, it's going to be very hard to change anything. So, all right, so let's move into some interventions here. Let me check the time. So somatic, what are things that can be helpful given this sort of daunting task that we've just sort of built this world of like, oh my gosh, how do I deal with this? And if we go through these 4 categories that I outlined earlier around anxiety, anxious responsiveness, somatic, the bodily sensations really ask for body-based interventions. And part of it is this responding to this hypervigilant awareness, this feeling of, okay, when am I going to freak out again? When am I going to have the feeling? First is to sort of relax around this feeling that you need to fix bodily sensations or escape from them. In fact, it's the escape tendency that perpetuates the cycle of anxiety. So the first thing we want to do in order to change our relationship to the anxiety is to feel like, you know what, this isn't something I have to fix or run away from. On the contrary, I'm going to stand and face it head on. Yeah. Yoga is very helpful. So yoga is an embodiment. Learning how to sort of find the center of gravity in your yoga posture and feel stability in the body. Know what's happening. Where am I off balance? But working with the physical body, very, very helpful. Or doing things like Tai Chi is also good. And but things that really help you gain a sense of strength. Now, for certain poses in asana practice, one wants to be mindful of what kind of trauma experience one has had. So there may be certain poses that put one in a vulnerable position. And we also want to be wary of any kind of physical touch that might be triggering for people. And those of you who are yoga teachers already know this. It's like, do you mind if I adjust you? But asking before touching someone is very important. Then there's this strategy for anxiety. I call it pressing on legs. It's not a terribly sophisticated title, but it's actually quite helpful. And what does this mean? So if one is feeling some kind of arousal in the body, some fear arousal in the body when they're sitting, is if your hands are palm up on your lap, simply to turn them over and just lightly press down on the tops of your legs, right, sort of at the thighs. Give yourself a gentle press on both legs. This helps to sort of ground you, but also it's kind of reassuring. You can do this right now if you like, and just gently press down. What you're doing is guiding your attention, your body's attention down into the ground, just to kind of gently settle. And it's a sensory experience. Yeah, you're not having to do like a mantra or anything, but it's just a gentle press, and then turn your palms back over, facing up, into a gesture of receptivity. If you start feeling anxious again, turning them back over, giving a gentle press down on the legs again. And a lot of this depends on your window of tolerance for the stress, yeah? But for some people, that's enough, just to have that feeling or that sensation. It's also helpful if you need to stay awake in your practice. Alternating finger presses are also helpful, and this is where you take your thumb and your index finger, yeah, and you just, if they're pointed up on your lap, or they can be in front of you like this, is to just go through all the fingers, the thumb touching the index finger, the middle finger, ring finger, pinky finger, and then going back the same way, and just do this light movement with the fingers and breathing as we do it. So we continue to practice breathing in, breathing out and we can start making it more and more gentle as we go, just lightly touching. Yeah. And then when you start feeling like you've settled, you can just sort of rest your hands back into sort of the still posture, the still mudra, if you will. And then if you get aroused again, you can just come back to do that. But that can also be very, very helpful. What I'm calling fist and release, I didn't know what else to title this either, but this involves closing your fists and squeezing as hard as you can. Yeah, this is if you're really struggling with anxiety. Maybe you're in you're at a sitting and the person who's leading meditation doesn't say a word for 45 minutes. Yeah, and you're starting to really feel like, oh my gosh, I'm going crazy with this practice. Is to just make fists and grip them as tight as you possibly can, really squeezing. You can feel the muscles in the wrists, but don't hurt yourself. That's the other thing. And then when you feel like you can't squeeze any harder, let go, open your palms, and feel the release. And what we're doing here is, this is another way of experiencing a release so that the vagal tone begins to settle here. Yeah? And then you can do it again. So this is another strategy, just to help you deal with any of that pent up anxious energy or mental energy. Breathing exercises, of course, doing pranayama breath work. The Ujjayi breath is very physical. Something that we've done before here, the spinal breath is a wonderful practice. Yawning, sighing, or shushing. The body scan, as I said earlier, sometimes that can trigger people. But it may be that you find the body scan really relaxing. It's okay just to focus on your left foot and then moving up the left leg and the space around the leg and then to the other side, and that helps to kind of settle. So part of it is knowing what works for you and what doesn't. And then there's another intervention that some therapists use called EMDR. Has anybody heard of this? Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Yeah. It's used in particular for trauma. And it uses eye movements that I've never done this, so I can't tell you kind of what the process is or what the movement sequences are. But I believe that it also happens with breath, and also you're sounding a mantra or a tone. Is that right? There's like yeah. Anyway, it is a mindfulness-based intervention for trauma. And the people I know who've done this, who have had a history of anxiety, say that it's really quite helpful. So anyway, you get the point here in terms of working with the body and somatic. The cognitive, again, we're talking about thoughts, self-talk, beliefs. Yeah, beliefs are a big part of this. My assumptions, and something called locus of control. Locus of control is just that sense that you can actually determine what happens to you, that you have some agency in this world. An external locus of control is that my life is being determined by the events around me, whereas an internal locus of control is that I actually can guide my life. I can have some agency in how I respond to things and in what happens to me. As well as self-efficacy, which we can also call confidence, and patterns. So these are all sort of cognitive processes. And some of the ways that we often will talk about this part of, kind of the mental body, if you will. There's a term in clinical psychology called decentering. And decentering means not getting rid of a feeling. So not getting rid of an anxious feeling, or if you're feeling a little triggered, but rather, we don't need to problem solve something that is there for a reason. It's a messenger. Yeah. But rather it's getting a perspective on it. It's not being so immersed in it that the narrative of it, what it's telling us, the thought patterns are taking over, but at some distance, bearing witness to the narrative itself, to the thought patterns. And so what we're really talking about here is further down on the list, something called metacognitive awareness. This is sort of a more pseudoscientific term for presence, for bearing witness, if you will. This is very important here in terms of getting this decentering experience, or bringing mindful presence to the thoughts you're having and to the beliefs and seeing them for what they are. And often they're ever changing. This helps us recognize the situation we're in a little more clearly. Yeah. There's also something called box breathing. Has anybody heard of this? Box breathing? Yeah. It's where, and if I get it wrong, let me know. Yeah, but my understanding of it is that on the in-breath, I imagine the breath moving across the top of a box this way. As I breathe out, then it descends down. And as I breathe in again, it follows the length of the bottom of the square. And then as I breathe out, it ascends back up to meet with the very first line. So you're actually tracking the box, the square, as you breathe in and breathe out. And this, some people who rely on this, who have anxiety issues, say it's actually really helpful because you're tracking something, your mind is focused on the movement, and you're visualizing the square with your in-breath and your out-breath, and it helps to kind of down-regulate. So this is, I don't know who came up with this particular approach, but it seems to be very helpful. And then curiosity. Let's be curious about these thoughts that we're having. Yeah, not judging them and going, oh, there's that thought again. I know I'm a negative person. I can't help it, and I'm caught up in it. Yeah, but become curious. What more here is possible besides this? Now, there's, as I said, there's a good reason why we have the thoughts we do and the patterns we do. But curiosity matters. It also gives us kind of a permission to think of alternate things or have other kinds of thoughts. Present moment. If you consider anxiety is always throwing us slightly into the future, then what happened to the present moment? Which is where mindfulness is trying to get us to really deepen our experience of the fullness of where we are right now. So when I used to take flights, long flights to Europe from San Francisco and back, when I used to visit my family there, I would be on the plane and I'd have a watch on, and I would constantly be looking at my watch. Okay, how much longer? How much longer? How much longer? Well, only 5 minutes have passed by, Chris. I'd look again, only 5 minutes. That contributed to the anxiety. So I finally thought, you know what? I stopped wearing a watch when I travel. Just, it doesn't matter. But what matters is just being here and now and being okay, doing whatever I need to do. As long as this trip takes, I am in the moment. I need to recognize that and just let go of the future altogether. That was enormously helpful. I don't know that that would work for everyone, but really being present, if you consider how anxiety is throwing us into the future constantly, bringing us back and rooting ourselves into where we are, just to have a break, just to have some stability in the moment. Belief in capacity, that just simply means know that you have resources that you may not be able to feel right now. I promise you, not all of you is feeling fear. I promise you. It's hard to get that through our heads. But when there is anxiety arising, and this is certainly what Buddhism teaches us, it teaches us to hold a feeling like fear in a space of awareness that is not suffering. Once we have that experience, we can begin to even the scales, yeah, the stress and the mindfulness. Now, we're not trying to get rid of anything, but we're trying to at least bring some balance so mindfulness can hold the stress. So we have some other frame of reference besides the fear itself, yeah? And then probably one of the most powerful parts of this, bringing a clear presence to the fear. So I found this to be extremely important. If I was feeling anxiety arising, I'm bringing a sharp, clear witness right into the fear. I'm not trying to make it go away. I'm not trying to say, get out of here. What happens if I do that? It's like trying to quiet a screaming child in a supermarket. Yeah. What happens if you go, shh, go, no, 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 no. It just gets louder. This is the same thing, I think, with anxiety. And so just rather than trying to make it go away or silence the mind with any kind of force, just bring a sense of open, bearing witness with love to this feeling, which we're not there yet. We're going there now here. The affective, feeling states, underlying emotions, rates. So this, I won't get too much into the distinction between emotions and affective traits tonight, just because I know that we're getting short on time here. But whatever feeling state is there, these are things that can also be quite helpful. Non-judgment. What would happen if we stopped judging the feelings we're having as desirable or undesirable, as good, as bad? I shouldn't feel this. I should be more of that. But bringing a sense of equanimity, and here equanimity doesn't mean apathy. It just means non-preference. It's just bearing witness to it without judging our feelings. That's really important. That, for anxiety, that seems to make a difference. Cultivating loving kindness and compassion. This is what the Buddha taught us to do around fear. Connecting with others through loving kindness and through compassion, or at the very least, bringing loving kindness and compassion to our own fears and our own feelings. So that's an important aspect. Connection to others. There's a practice called Tonglen that some of us have done here before. And it's also helpful to go, oh, I'm feeling anxious. Others too feel this too. I'm not the only one feeling this feeling. There are so many who know what this feels like. And so many throughout history that have known what this feels like. And so many more in the future that will know what this feels like. Yeah. Maybe this anxiety isn't as personal as it feels. And so here it's really sort of connecting out, widening the circle of our heart to be reminded this is a universal feeling. It's not pleasant, but it is something that so many people feel. So this is what I mean by connection to others. So we're widening the circle. Polarity breathing, breathing in a state that's helpful, breathing out fear. For me, it used to help to work. Breathing in a sense of trust and opening to that, sort of the lightness of trust, and then breathing out the smoky quality of fear. And just putting that into the breath can also help to drop. Strong back, soft front, we've done that here. Balancing equanimity and compassion, some stability with love. Creativity, expression, very helpful for feelings. Maybe you journal or you write music, but start putting words to what is below the anxiety. After all, it's like letting the air out of a tire, just psss. You know, there is something there seeking. This is what anxiety is. It's a messenger. There's something there seeking an expression that maybe we have not uncovered yet. For me, it was anger. And once I realized that underlying the anxiety were a couple of things. One was anger, another was grief, was sorrow, sadness. All of a sudden, the anxiety evaporated immediately. And so when I would feel anxious, if I was on a retreat or something, I would kind of remind myself, this anxiety is kind of a red herring. There's something else here. What could that be? So sometimes the expression, if you're a poet or a writer, you can sort of give a voice to what is not feeling good that isn't just fear. Very helpful. Yeah. Gentle awareness, the spirit of generosity, patience. There's another one here that's out of view. It's called dual awareness. Anyway, we don't have to worry about that. Dual awareness is really just cultivating a capacity to hold two states at the same time. You know, so we can hold a feeling of fear and we can hold a feeling of presence, of mindful awareness or gentleness simultaneously. And that's a capacity that if we're working with a trauma-informed mentor or teacher or therapist, can really help us build this capacity to do that. Trelevin talks about that in his book, Dual Awareness. Okay, and then the last category here, The spiritual dimension of anxiety is checking in. Is there a sense of existential connection in my life? Is there a sense of meaningfulness here? Or am I feeling kind of vacant? There was a period in my life where I had a little bit of what's called hypochondriasis. Yeah, I thought I had every disease that somebody would tell me about. And then when I started to research it, I found that a lot of people who have this problem, it's a mask for misery. It's a mask for being very unsatisfied and miserable in your life situation. And that was true at the time. And once I realized that, all of a sudden it was like, okay, if I'm pressing this thing here in my armpit, this is just misery expressing itself. This doesn't mean that I'm sick and I need to go to a doctor. So it's getting to know what that is. And meaninglessness, or a lack of sense of connection and meaningfulness in our lives, a lack of sense of purpose, can also be anxiety producing. And this was Viktor Frankl's sort of message to us. An existential vacuum is the cause of most neuroses, meaning that there is no meaning in my life, therefore I'm going to start to suffer. We have this thing that he called a will to meaning. We are wired for meaning, and if we don't have it, we suffer. Often it shows up as anxiety. So finding things that are really deeply meaningful matter. So as part of some of the interventions, this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but practicing with love or compassion meditation is very helpful to connect us with something deeper and more meaningful, perhaps. Deity meditation. So for me, practicing with green Tara or white Tara more recently, Padmasambhava, Guru Padmasambhava. So for those of us who are in the Vajrayana tradition, he is a sort of a central figure. And so meditating with these beings, or if you're a Christian, or if you're sort of not, you're agnostic, just practicing with that which is beyond you. Yeah, that there is a network. If you're a Unitarian Universalist, the interdependent web of all existence. This is not dead matter. This is an alive process. So maybe it's meditating with that. Yeah. Chanting or prayer can help connect us. Yeah. If you've ever tried to do a retreat, a solitary retreat, or tried to meditate and gone, man, I am not feeling it today, just focusing in on some chanting, if you have a prayer life, but that reconnecting with that which is not just in your closed system of your own mind. Reflecting on your ontology, the way of being in the world. What else is here besides me and this body? And how do I relate to the wider reality of life? Expanding awareness, so that awareness can always be cultivated to become more and more spacious. This is the endeavor of meditation. And then finally, service or self-actualization, getting involved, doing things that help. Yeah, doing some selfless service, volunteering for whatever cause really speaks to you, and being really involved in life in some way, even if it's not your ultimate purpose. Just getting involved. Yeah, it's remarkably helpful for anxiety to do this. All right, we won't worry about this slide. This is just largely the four foundations of mindfulness, how they impact our perceptual field. It's very interesting. The point here being really just body, feelings, mind, and insights. If you study mindfulness, you can begin to cultivate a capacity to relate to the different dimensions of who we are, on these different levels. So I think this will be our final slide, and this is kind of a very important one. Practices for PTSD. So if someone, or if you yourself has a history of trauma or PTSD, what is a good way to practice? So we've talked about all the problems. Now, what are some skillful solutions? For one thing, keeping sessions very short. Practice for 5 minutes. That's it. Yeah. Do multiple practices that are short instead of trying to sit for one long half-hour session. Keep them manageable. Keep the goals simple. Breathing practices, of course, as we mentioned earlier, the Ujjayi breath, spinal breathing, doing things that are very active breath practices so that your senses are engaged and you can really feel the practice in an embodied way through your senses. The hand exercises mentioned earlier. So if you're sitting for 5 minutes, you can do the leg pressing, you can do the alternate finger things, you can do the sighing, but there are ways to sort of bring your embodiment into line with the practice in short periods of time. Embodied practice like postures or walking meditation, very helpful. Doing mindful walking. So your body is in movement, you're actually cultivating one of the 4 postures that the Buddha taught. How do we practice mindfulness? In seated position, standing, lying down, and walking. Also doing more guided meditations as opposed to just going, okay, I'm just going to count my breaths and just focus on that. It may be helpful to have someone guide you or have a guided resource to do short guided meditations or more active practices, what we might call active relaxation. Visualizations are helpful if one can visualize. Not everybody is good at visualizing, nor is it something that comes easily. But visualization is that kind of active relaxation. So we did a garden meditation a few weeks ago. That would be considered an active relaxation using visualization. The chanting. So one of the things I've done is adapt the Vajra chant, Om Ahum, to kind of more of a secular practice for people who have trauma. And the reason why people seem to find that helpful, including this veteran that I worked with, he taught it to all his buddies as well, and they loved it. It's that it locates it in a particular part of the body. So the Om, you chant it right in the center of the forehead. You imagine clear white light emanating from here and an embodied presence as you do the chant. And then the Ah down the base of the throat in expression of all things are as they are, an expression of clear red light, shining that out, and then Hum down into the heart, compassion, love, loving kindness, in clear blue light, and then you just circle through Om, and then Ah, and then Hum, and that is, for somebody who cannot meditate, often doing this for a few minutes will serve the same purpose. And maybe not, it may not serve the same purpose as someone who is in deep meditation or deep retreat for, a couple of weeks or what have you. But it is a way to cultivate an intermediate state between living with chronic stress of anxiety or PTSD and the opposite, which is settling into an open mind of suchness or emptiness that is a place where things can arise that are not so fun. So this has not been researched in my mind, in my awareness, but there is a lot of potential here in sounding tones with intention that are infused with vibration, intention, and expression that could be really, really helpful. I actually presented this to a mindfulness and trauma workshop at Harvard many years ago. And none of the psychologists or mindfulness teachers had ever thought of this. So it's something that really bears some merit. Here's the dual awareness. I already mentioned that, holding multiple things in your attention at once. Important also to work with a trauma-sensitive teacher or mentor. So rather than trying to do this alone, if you do and you find yourself stuck, rather than give up hope, find someone you can work with one-on-one. Yeah. And chances are they'll know, if you can tell them kind of where you are in your PTSD journey. The great Judith Herman, the psychologist at Harvard, who wrote the book Trauma and Recovery, has these 3 primary phases. If you're in the first one, which is needing to cultivate safety, you may do a different kind of practice than you would if you're in the second or the third phase. So this is another reason why it can be helpful to work with somebody who's trauma informed. As I mentioned earlier, the EMDR. And then finally, just know your own window of tolerance. And this is really about how much discomfort can I actually sit with before it doesn't work anymore? Yeah. Sometimes a little discomfort, we can practice with it. And if it settles, we gain capacity. If it doesn't and it escalates, then we need to know that. And we need to sort of back away, come out of practice, or do something that's more grounding. And that window of tolerance will change from one day to the next. Yeah. It may be that one day we're like, man, I am feeling it today and it feels pretty good. I'm going to keep going for half an hour. And then the next day, something triggers us and we can't. So being open to just the changes in window of tolerance matters. And that's it. Wow, that took an hour and a half. I was hoping we'd have more time, but this was a lot of information. I hope that, if you are someone that has struggled with any of these issues, that there was something in there that spoke to you. I'm happy to make these slides available as well. If you're interested, let me know and I can send them to you.